The current atmosphere of polarization, of toxicity, of misinformation, of disinformation, of anger directed at individuals and institutions is not a healthy trend line.
Those core tenets of our democracy are under attack today like never before.
As we begin this election year, we must be clear. Democracy is on the ballot.
The radical left Democrats rigged the presidential election in 2020, and we're not going to let them rig the presidential election in 2024.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's very simple. Victory or death.
Hello, I'm Michael Serapio.
And I am Omaira Issa.
The growth of social media platforms and ongoing cuts to news outlets right across the country, mis and disinformation is everywhere. We wanted to find out how that sheer amount of inaccurate and false information circulating online and within our communities might affect our democracy.
So we commissioned an Abacus data survey in April. It shows that 84% of Canadians say they are concerned about the spread of misinformation and disinformation, while 32% admit to having shared information that may not have been true. Given the content generated by AI, and given that we are not always able to tell fact from fiction, how many of us may end up believing what is in fact disinformation?
In this Detecting Disinformation for Democracy special, experts, politicians, and representatives of the biggest web giants talk about the most urgent disinformation concerns and offer some solutions. We begin south of the border, where work is underway to tackle the problem globally as Americans prepare to head to elect their president in November. Here now is James Rubin. He is Special Envoy and Coordinator of the U.S. State Department's Global Engagement Center.
Well, I think it's very important for people to understand what precisely the terms of art are, and disinformation is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, and it's very important for me to define terms here. Every government has and will communicate its point of view, why it's pursuing its policies, and they should be able to do that, and nobody has a problem with that. Except perhaps in the case of Russia having invaded Ukraine, we had a problem with RT. But generally speaking, governments can and will communicate their point of view. Where disinformation comes in, real disinformation, is when governments, primarily governments, but could be non-state actors as well, intentionally lie about a problem in order to divide, in order to change policies, in order to affect elections, in order to confuse adversaries. When China or Russia or Iran or terrorist groups promulgate some terrible lie and don't admit that it's they who are doing it through false, perhaps using bots rather than real individuals on the internet, through buying up a journalist and buying their services and having them write it, where they're not labeling it as coming from the Communist Party of China or coming from the Kremlin. All those different forms are what add up together to what I would call information warfare. And the truth is that Russia and the CCP, the Communist Party of China, have been using information warfare against the United States and its allies around the world for many, many, many years. They spend billions and billions of dollars on it. And it's only recently, I think, that the West, the United States, Canada, our governments, have appreciated the extent to which this kind of information warfare goes on. Information is part and parcel of a democracy's way of life. It's the lifeblood of a democracy, to have basic facts so that governments and people and groups can make decisions based on basic facts. And without that lifeblood, that information running smoothly, democracies are seriously challenged. You know, there's a phrase called DIME, which is diplomacy, information, military, economic. Those are all the different ways you pursue your foreign policy. For Russia and for the Communist Party of China, the I part of DIME is a big deal. They deal with it at a high level. They spend billions of dollars. Similarly for Russia. For the United States, and unfortunately for most of our Western allies, information is often thought of as a communications problem, something you can fix with spending a little more money here, a little more money there. But as a result of the prominence of social media, as a result of the 24-hour news world we live in and the information revolution, China and Russia now have incredibly available tools through this information revolution to damage our democracies. And we don't, by contrast, have an ability to operate behind their walls. Information is a domain, the way air space is a domain, sea space is a domain, cyber is a domain, meaning that that information, what their citizens read, see, and watch, should be sovereign in the sense that Russia or China, if they want to say something to a citizen in that country, should say it openly with their name on it, to have China's CCP stamp when they are communicating some piece of information about what they think the world should look like or the way the United States behaves. Same with the Kremlin. And when that doesn't happen, when Russia or the CCP in Beijing secretly, covertly enter the information space of an African country or a Latin American country, in my opinion, that's like a violation of their sovereignty because they're not doing it openly. We can't control, and frankly, we don't want to control what everybody says. That's not our job. What we want is to have more information for people to make judgments. If they find out that some website or a radio station says, for example, the United States has biological weapons in Bulgaria, they might have a certain reaction. But what if they read, Russia says the United States has biological weapons in Bulgaria? They will have a completely different reaction. And we want them to be only living in the second world, not the first world, the world where Russia can secretly, without putting their name on it, without their hidden hand being known, try to communicate disinformation to citizens in democracies around the world. And what I am most worried about is that the world of democratic countries and countries who believe that their information space is sovereign, which should be almost everybody in the world, will not find a way to uniformly and together defend themselves against the billions and billions of dollars spent by the Communist Party of China to try to manipulate information, and the billions of dollars spent by Russia to try to lie their way out of President Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
We are facing unprecedented challenges to our democracy. U.S. is facing these challenges. Canada is facing these challenges. Europe is facing these challenges. Democracies around the world are, and there are several of them. One is the fact that Russia and China in particular have found that cyber attacks are cheap, and they've invested in them, and they are committed to doing this for the foreseeable future. Secondly, in the United States, we are polarized. We're divided more than we've been in a long time, and therefore susceptible to propaganda. Thirdly, our government and our companies, the social media platforms, the technology platforms, are not cooperating and working with each other to take down disinformation like they were in 2020. It's worse than it was in 2020 and 2024. So that's a big challenge. And then lastly, we have this introduction of AI and regenerative, capability AI that can imitate voices of US presidents and potentially disrupt turnout and do all kinds of harmful things to voters who may be susceptible to this. So we are in uncharted territory, and we are facing challenges on a scale and volume that we've never faced before. We have this grand experiment, America, that it's not military leaders in charge, it's not kings and queens, it's not, a monarchy. It is the average man and woman that's in charge here. And they run our government, they tell the government what to do, but they have to be so-called enlightened with good information. When bad information comes into the system, when propaganda comes in, when false information comes in, that is highly destructive to our system for many, many reasons. So we've got our work cut out for us, but we've got a great long history of success in America to overcome challenges and obstacles. And I think we all remember Abraham Lincoln's great words that democracy is something you have to fight for every single generation. It's not taken for granted.
The state of this democracy is teetering. I mean that. We forget, we're what? We're 3.5 years removed from a presidential election where the losing candidate literally tried to overthrow an election. I mean, think about that. And my former party. And right now, 70 to 80% of my former political party does not believe Joe Biden won. I think America today is still the world's oldest democracy. We're no longer the world's greatest democracy. And maybe it's because we're so old. This country is extremely divided. I went to Congress 8-10 years ago, and even at that point, I wondered, can we stay together? Can this experiment stay together? Here we are 8 to 10 years later, and we've got people in states who want to secede. People within states who want to secede from their state and create another state. This is a really divided country right now, dangerously divided. It's so hard to combat the disinformation and misinformation, the lies and the conspiracies that are out there right now, because it's hard to reach everybody. Because again, everybody is going somewhere different to get their news. 80% of my former political party doesn't believe Trump lost. And they don't. And again, I was a Trump supporter at one time. I still engage with these people all the time. They don't. Most of those people, no matter what the result is in November, won't believe it if he loses. A democracy dies if the people no longer accept the election results. We have elections every 2 years. It's like the silent pact we have with each other. We work our asses off to win. If our candidate doesn't win, we all agree to accept the winners and the losers. It's like the heartbeat of a democracy. And if you destroy that process, if you get to a point where half of this country, we talk about election results, but if you get to a point where half this country doesn't accept the will of the people, then that heart stops beating. Then the democracy is done. And we're at a point right now where the heart is on life support. I really believe that.
There's a lot of information on the internet, but not all of it is factual. You have probably heard the terms misinformation and disinformation, but what are the differences between them? According to the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, the key is intent. Misinformation refers to false information that is not intended to cause harm. For example, a family member accidentally shares false information about vaccines. Disinformation is false information that is intended to manipulate, cause damage, or guide people, organizations, and countries in the wrong direction. This includes propaganda from foreign countries and other actors, often weaponized and meant to provoke emotional responses and sow confusion. And then there is malinformation, which stems from the truth but is often exaggerated in a way that misleads and causes potential harm.
Disinformation has been around for a very long time, in fact, centuries. But we've really seen sort of this modern phase of disinformation being used very widely, both by foreign authoritarians who want to deceive us, want to manipulate us.
So often when you're looking for something like disinformation or misinformation, you have to identify what's the source of it. And some of it is going to come from state level actors, some of it will come from communities, often who consider themselves to be truth seekers, but there's also online grifters and other people with their own agendas who are spreading misinformation and disinformation.
Social media has just made this all so much easier for those that do want to deceive us to disseminate that information. The ability for anyone to publish any sort of information that they want to. And I think our failure as a society to inoculate citizens so that they have a better understanding of the information that they're consuming, to have those critical cognitive filters that allow them to sort of pick out the information that they're seeing, and to make sure that they're questioning whether it's the sources or some of the claims that are being made in those pieces that they're consuming on social media.
In an Abacus data survey commissioned by CPAC, 84% of respondents said they were concerned about the spread of misinformation and disinformation, with 42% blaming social media for spreading it. As concerns increase about the spread of misinformation and disinformation, 1 in 5 Canadians are turning to non-traditional media for their news, and more than 7 out of 10 respondents were somewhat or very concerned about the state of democracy in Canada.
We wanted to understand where Canadians get their news and what their sources of information are. So we sent our teams out to ask Canadians.
Principalement sur Internet. C'est pas surprenant.
Mainly on the internet. I pay a lot of attention to the media. I'm from Europe, so I've been here for 20 years, but I still have my old habits. I get my information from media that are really known to be reliable, and then I really try to sort things out.
Le tri, c'est pas facile.
Sur Internet.
On the internet. But so am I. On LCN. I watch LCN part of the day.
J'ai plusieurs sources. Je peux y aller aux réseaux.
I too have several sources. On social networks, on websites, but I still have to check the reliability of the site in question.
Ça dépend.
It depends. I'd say social networks, but also maybe morning news. Then it depends what kind of information you're talking about.
Eh ben, je suis comme pas sur les réseaux.
And I'm not on social networks. I don't consume news. It would be more word of mouth now. I don't have the internet anymore.
Sur les réseaux sociaux et puis à la télévision.
On social networks and then on television. That's about it.
Après ça.
The same thing. We read the papers on our tablets, and then that's where we go to get what we want.
Across the country and around the world, newsrooms are shrinking as the need for verified information and a way to combat disinformation increases. We asked leaders in the journalism field about the challenges the industry is facing.
So my job basically involves investigating bad stuff on social media, everything from disinformation and conspiracy theories to hate, algorithms and polarization, and exposing their real world impact. And I do that across a range of different formats. I think that for me, there are 2 questions I always ask myself when I'm deciding what to investigate, particularly in terms of disinformation. The first is how viral the content has become. How many people is it reaching? Is it worthy of me investigating it, or do I risk amplifying it to more people? And the second question, perhaps for me the most important question, is what is its real world impact and what harm is it having?
One of the challenges around journalists investigating and fact-checking kind of the information environment around us is that the truth is, I think a lot of newsrooms are still trying to keep up with the skills and the approaches that are needed to investigate information out there. We have a vastly different media environment than we did 10, especially 20 years ago, and certainly earlier than that. There are fewer and fewer journalists on the job, so there's less people to kind of be that check and balance.
There are 3 things that concern me as a fact checker and someone in the verification space. First is the rise of audio deepfakes. They're increasingly more sophisticated and believable, and it's increasingly difficult to identify without a doubt whether or not this is a deepfake, an audio deepfake specifically in that case. Also, what concerns me is just like around 10 years ago, just under 10 years ago, there would be this is fake news, or you can't believe that news. That kind of entered our lexicon. And one fear I do have, or one concern that we're monitoring, is how blaming information that is true on being deepfake or AI is sowing distrust in information that might be genuine. And lastly, another concern is just for people who are absorbing, the public, and hoping that media literacy is increasingly in the back of the mind.
One of the probably most effective, interventions around this issue is unfortunately one of the hardest, which is to really recapitalize journalism, especially local news, to create voices that people can trust in their communities and help them discern what's real, what's not. Unfortunately, the tech ecosystem has also created a market dynamic where journalism is struggling.
We've trained thousands of journalists over the years, many of whom are now forming the open source investigation teams set up at places like the BBC or CNN or the Financial Times. So for us, it's really about making sure that those journalists are trained to do that themselves, rather than trying to centralize everything around the work of Bellingcat. It's very hard to find the truth. And if you're someone, especially who is trying to take a neutral position on a topic where you have that happening, you end up getting attacked from both sides. So it really pushes out the kind of middle of the discussion. And so you end up with online discussions that are really dominated by the loudest and angriest voices. And that for me is something that's really concerning. And it's certainly gotten worse over the last 6 months.
And whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic or whether it is around wars that are unfolding right now in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, different kind of, whenever anything happens, any kind of terror attack or attack, after any of those events, there is this wave of disinformation and hate. And it often has really serious consequences, not just for us trying to figure out what's actually happening, but for the people who are caught up in this, often who are living through the most difficult things and just trying to make sense of that. And I quite recently investigated how the mayor of London had an AI-generated piece of audio that was used to target him. It was faking his voice, suggesting he was going to move the Armistice Day celebrations we have to commemorate people who've died during wars, that he was going to move those to accommodate a pro-Palestinian protest. And it purported to be a secret recording, and it did sound quite a lot like him. And so you can understand why people, perhaps when it played into their biases and they then not very keen on the mayor or they were shocked by the audio, started to share it. And it spread like wildfire in particular groups and actually seemed to contribute to tensions offline when there were kind of various confrontations between the police and counter-protesters who were very angry about a pro-Palestinian rally and extra angry about this audio.
They often kind of target the fault lines in society or in a particular country. And so certainly over time, we've seen evolution of the tactics for misinformation and disinformation, how easy it is to run fake accounts on social media and spread lies and misinformation. But at the core of it, a lot of times it's about getting into people's heads, appealing to their emotion, appealing to pre-existing beliefs, and trying to hit them with narratives that create a sense of division or in a way trick them into doing something they might not otherwise do. Elections are really almost in some ways kind of the Super Bowl for mis and disinformation. Elections are a time when the stakes are really high.
And in the US context, one of the more famous examples is the fact that ahead of the primaries, there was what was called a Biden robocall. And by this robocall was that there was someone who sounded like Biden, it was AI generated, and that was disseminated through these robocalls to discourage people from voting in the primaries.
Humanity exists in a stew of lies and nonsense. I mean, that's been the case for the vast majority of the existence of the species. But now we've created technologies that essentially play to the worst identity dynamics, the worst political dynamics. And unfortunately, I think that may have a bad effect on democracy.
I'm Margaret Sullivan, and I'm a columnist for The Guardian US, writing weekly on politics, media, and culture. I spent a great deal of my career in local journalism at a local newspaper in my hometown of Buffalo, New York. I started there as a summer intern and eventually became the top editor of the paper. And I saw over my time there that the local journalism that we were doing was extremely important for tying the community together and giving people a common set of facts so that, you can disagree, you can have different opinions about things, but do you have sort of a basic understanding of the reality? And that's what newspapers and local media does all over the country and in fact all over the world. But that is fading. I mean, my newspaper, which had for many years 200 people in its newsroom, now is down to about 50. And you simply cannot do the job The paper is now owned by a chain, which is what's happened all over the country. Hedge funds have come in, and this is happening everywhere. So there are 2 newspapers a week going out of business in the United States, most of those weeklies, but not all. And what we're seeing as a result is that people no longer have, in many areas, no longer have a common ground of reality to walk on, and a kind of a common ground that gives you the ability to be in a democracy, to self-govern. Journalism helps us understand what's going on in our world. It holds government accountable. It holds powerful people accountable, business people and others in a community. It allows people to do the basic work of democracy, which is to self-govern, to go to the voting booth informed about who's running, to know how your schools in your area are running, to know how your taxes are being spent. If we don't have that, and that comes with the labor-intensive and rather expensive work of reporting, then as citizens, we're hobbled. We can't really do the work of democracy, which is to govern ourselves. I think that we need to be focused as journalists on the stakes and the consequences of this election. Not so much on polls, not so much on the horse race, who's ahead this day, who's behind this day, but rather what happens when this person or this person is elected. And Trump helps us in this way because he's been very upfront about what he wants to do, and it's very scary. He gave an interview recently to Time Magazine, and when you read the interview about the kinds of things he wants to do, about deporting people, about tracking women's pregnancies, all these sorts of things, about putting his allies in places in which there have traditionally been public servants and civil servants, it's really very scary. But do people know that? Is the media really getting that across? Or are we hearing endless stories about the outrage of the day, the gaffe of the day, how old these candidates are, particularly how old Joe Biden is? And we know how old they are. It doesn't actually change day to day. But that's where the emphasis is, and not very much on the stakes. So my friend, another press critic, Jay Rosen, who's at NYU, has an expression which has caught on a little bit, which is, and it's a horse race metaphor, he says, not the odds, but the stakes. And I think if we can keep that in mind, we shouldn't be covering the odds, who's up, who's down, who's going to win, what exactly is happening in this poll. But the stakes of the election, I think, will be in much better shape in terms of informing the public. In some fairly basic way, democracy is on the ballot. So, we never want to, we're always very wary of being accused of being in any candidate's camp. And that's not what I'm saying here. But I am saying that if Donald Trump is elected again, I think we have real threats to democracy, and people should absolutely be aware of that. We only have to look at the recent past to know. The 2020 election is one that we know was legitimate. There was no great rigging. There was no horrible election fraud. And yet former President Trump continues to this day to say that he was the one who was actually elected. And he requires, as a sort of loyalty test or litmus test for anyone he endorses or anyone that he would put in power, to say with him that the election was illegitimate. And we also saw what happened on January 6th with the siege of the Capitol. I mean, we already know what will happen, and we were saved from some of the worst effects of that by people who were wonderful public servants, secretaries of state, who refused to go along with, sort of the fraud that was being asked for. But in a new term, I think that wouldn't be the case. There would be a really strong effort to have allies everywhere and a very free hand. America's powerful, and it does help to set the tone. I think that the kind of populism that, if that's the right word for it, that Trump has embodied is a movement that's spreading throughout the world. And, I think there is a kind of a spread that will happen if he's elected. It gives a sort of power, and it gives a kind of approval to other leaders who want to also go down a road of authoritarianism or near authoritarianism. We have to sort of help each other and remind each other what our democracy is based on, which is the involvement of citizens. So I think there's leadership, and it doesn't have to be at the highest levels. It can be your neighbor. You can say, for example, to your neighbor, what are your news sources? Oh, do you subscribe to the Buffalo News? And if they say, oh no, I get my news on TikTok, you may want to challenge that or at least help inform them. So I think it's a multi-part thing, and there's no single answer, but we all have to try.
As newsrooms struggle to verify information quickly, trust in traditional media is mixed. We asked Canadians if they watch and trust traditional media. Here's what they told us.
I believe that traditional news, more than other news, is prepared to dig to find out what they're representing is at least accurate. Do I think it's 100%? Nope. I think they get duped like everybody else, but I think they're at least making the effort.
I'm from Russia. I never trust news whatsoever.
I am a person who has, I think, a lot of faith in traditional news media.
100% not, because we're manipulated and lied to on a daily basis, and all you have to do is look at what's going on in Gaza and watch things real time on YouTube, and then watch how it's covered to realize you're being lied to.
There's enough safeguards in our society and laws that keep traditional news media accountable. Of course, there's always going to be biases.
Yeah, they're like my trusted source, actually. I feel like if I haven't seen the news on those channels, I'm a bit, sketchy about other sources first. I'm like, if I haven't seen it, if I heard it on the news, if I haven't seen it in traditional, like traditional papers and things like that, yeah. So I trust them more.
You look at the CBC and, the big national stations, I mean, it's just bullshit. It's all government controlled.
Nous vous avons expliqué ce que sont la désinformation et la vérification des faits dans les médias.
We've explained disinformation and fact-checking in news media. Are Canadians concerned about it? Philippe Fournier is the brains behind Quebec 125, which uses opinion polls, electoral history and demographics to predict election results.
Je ne sais pas si les Canadiens...
I don't know if Canadians yet understand the seriousness of the risk posed by misinformation and disinformation.
Désinformation et la misinformation.
More and more Canadians, especially young people, spend a good part of their lives online, and information is drowning in a sea of misinformation, and it's getting harder and harder to sort things out.
Une mer de désinformation, et c'est de plus en plus difficile de faire la différence. Alors quand j'ai regardé le sondage...
So when I look at the survey, I break down the numbers. I see that Canadians recognise that this could be a problem for democratic institutions. I don't know if the seriousness of the problem is well understood, especially among younger voters, though.
Particulièrement chez les jeunes électeurs. Le risque est certainement...
The risk is certainly that politicians with bad intentions might try to take advantage of it if they're trying to win an election. Basically, the end justifies the means. They must win at all costs, even at the cost of misinforming, lying, and offering easy solutions that are based on misinformation.
Celles qui sont basées sur des informations erronées, je crois...
I believe that democracies are in danger. We can have our opinions, but we can't have our own facts. Disinformation on the internet produces alternative facts. And if we can't agree on the same reality, democracies have no chance of surviving. So I think the problem is not just that misinformation is available, but that it's so good that people can't tell the difference.
La désinformation soit disponible, mais qu'elle soit tellement de bonne qualité que les gens ne font plus la différence. Évidemment, il y a des politiciens.
Of course, there are politicians and civil society players who are actively working to undermine trust. This is nothing new. I grew up in Quebec City. There are radio stations there that attack the credibility of the media outright, saying that they're talking nonsense, they're unbiased. We're not, when of course that's not true. There are biases everywhere. You just have to sort them out. But if there's monetary gain to be made from undermining our institutions, unfortunately that's what'll happen. We're in a generally free society run by capitalism. Retake after we're not. There are biases everywhere. You just have to sort them out. But if there's a monetary gain to be made from undermining our institutions, unfortunately that's what will happen. We live in a generally free society based on capitalism, and so, if there's money to be made, it's going to be made. Could this lead to an erosion of our institutions? For the moment, it seems limited. But we see the example south of the border. We see what rage instead of information can produce as a reaction.
As James Rubin of the US State Department explained, the information war is an international problem. Detecting disinformation is becoming increasingly difficult as AI-generated content becomes more widespread.
Now, while artificial intelligence is making our lives easier in many ways, it is also challenging democracy. In a moment, we'll look at some of those challenges, but first, here is what Canadians have to say about using AI.
I use AI in everyday life. Like I use AI on call for my studies, for video call as well, to play games, like I'm surrounded by AI. If there is no AI, I cannot leave.
No, I use no technology at all.
Well, I go on ChatGPT and ask for advice. Used to be a teacher. I've looked at suggestions from ChatGPT as well, and I guess AI is yes, just a help for us to live in a better way.
I'm an executive director of a nonprofit, so we have a lot of things we do with AI in trying to enhance our services.
I still believe that the human brain should be used.
I don't use AI technology, not yet at least, or not that I know of.
I think it makes me a little bit nervous. I'm a university student, and I feel like there are some students nowadays who kind of like use it in their essay writing, and like I'm a TA and I can kind of spot that, and it kind of freaks me out.
I just started to use AI just for some of the ads that we use for work, just to create some images and a couple of little short videos that we started to try out on.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that. That is what Hal, the computer and the brain of the Discovery spaceship, told Dave, the human in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, released in 1968. More than 50 years later, that artificial intelligence fictional computer character is still referenced as we debate the way forward with artificial intelligence, or AI. So what is AI? Simply put, it is technology with massive amounts of information inputted into computers and machines to simulate human intelligence, including the ability to problem solve. In other words, human capabilities and traits are reverse engineered to achieve a specific purpose, such as writing a paper, asking Siri, Alexa, or Google Assist to send an email, give the weather forecast, or call someone. AI is about using human understanding to solve problems to make our lives easier.
Artificial intelligence technologies have really the potential to change lots of the ways we work, play, consume information, and participate in the economy. And Canada had quite a big advantage on AI. A lot of the leading researchers came out of Canada, and the people that they trained are the ones who have often been involved in building some of the big companies, training some of the models that are now being used to generate some really valuable intellectual property.
AI is all around us. It's being used in healthcare, in finance, and in transportation. We use AI in our homes and online.
There are all kinds of potential benefits for AI in democracy. They're mostly unexplored, but as this technology evolves, I think we'll start to see a number.
In an Abacus data survey commissioned by CPAC in April, about half of Canadians, 48%, were somewhat familiar with AI. That number increased to 68% for young people aged 18 to 29. But there are concerns about AI and democracy. More than 3/4 of Canadians surveyed, 80%, were concerned about the potential misuse of AI to spread disinformation during an election.
While nearly half of Canadians are somewhat familiar with AI, the Abacus data survey found that 82% believe AI blurs the lines between reality and falsehood. And as the use of AI continues to grow, how is it changing the digital ecosystem and information itself? Taylor Owen is founding director of the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University in Montreal.
We are very quickly heading to a place where most information, the majority of information in the digital ecosystem is going to be generated by AI. So what happens when, and it's astounding to pause on that. Within a few years of generative AI being deployed on society, there will be more AI created content than has been created by humans in all of human history. Within a matter of a few years, which is remarkable. And what happens when the majority of content we see and we live in is created by an AI? I don't think we know. I don't love that proposition. And I think there's something about detaching humans from information that is shared in a democratic society, produced and shared and interpreted in a democratic society. That's going to change our democracy in a real way. I don't think we know how yet. It's also going to change the character of the models themselves. All of a sudden, models are going to be trained these AI models are going to be trained not just on content created by humans and trying to build on that to generate something. They're going to be trained on a majority of content that's already been designed, that's already been produced by AIs. And again is going to be a step change in, I think, the character of our public discourse. We desperately are going to need signals of reliability. When that supply side challenge of AI really comes to fruition, where we have no way of detelling the provenance of a video or a piece of text or an image, what does that mean for a democratic society? If every time we open our feeds, the vast majority of what we see is just created by AI, and we don't know if it's real or not, and there's a problem there. And in some ways, it's a journalistic problem. This is what journalism has always done, right? Is looked out at the world and interpreted reality with some sort of process embedded in that, and then communicated that to publics. But what's that act going to look like in a world mediated by AI? And I think that's a problem we have to solve pretty quickly. I think we need to get our house in order before we worry too much about the next thing. And that means making sure social media platforms are as safe as they can be and operating with our best interests in mind rather than those of large multinational companies, right? So as a baseline, I think, yes, we need to figure out, so we still all live in social media worlds. Our politics are in many ways happening inside these ecosystems, and we live in them in really meaningful ways. So we have to make them safer and serving our better economic and political and social interests. The question then, though, is if these very same companies are betting their futures on a new technology, how do we want to enter into that dialogue with them? So we now know that Meta and Google and Microsoft, and these are well-known entities now, they've been around for a while, are now building a new thing. And that new thing could have profound impact on our societies. We don't know it will for sure, but when the biggest companies in human history are betting tens or hundreds of billions of dollars on a new thing, we should probably pay attention to that, it seems to me, and take it seriously. But what have we learned from engaging with these companies for the past 15 years that we should take away when we enter into this new thing? And I think one is that assurances that they are building things in the public interest should not be taken at face value. And that's not sort of to incriminate them or to render judgment. So if we are going to normalize ourselves to a world where a majority of content is created by AI, it would be really nice to know what is created by humans. And the Online Harms Act actually in Canada has a provision in it that forces companies to identify AI-generated content. And some of them are signing on to doing this in some way. We don't fully know because it's sort of a self-regulatory action. But if governments force companies to come up with clear flagging mechanisms for everything that's created by AI versus what's created by humans, then we might have a chance, I think, of holding on to the sort of human creative side of our public sphere, which I think is the thing that we have to be fighting for right now, the most powerfully.
So we've explained what artificial intelligence is and how it's being used. But how do Canadians feel about the rise of generative AI and the spreading of false information, particularly during an election? Well, David Coletto is the founder, the chair, and the CEO of Abacus Data, the company that conducted the survey commissioned by CPAC.
Canadians have quickly become aware that AI is a threat, that AI can be used to distort any information flow, and at an election can be quite impactful, could change potentially the outcome of an election, because you might see a video out there that's actually not real, but could have a big influence over what people think and has very little time to be corrected, right? That's how fast information moves today. But I also think it reflects a deep concern about people's ability right now and no service or no way to verify, is this information real or not? And even if you had a news organization saying this video is false, but trust in that organization might not be at highs or very high, do I even trust the news organization that's telling me that it's false? So there's this it's like an onion. You kind of peel it back and you start to see there are deep layers and complexities right now. And I think the great fear that I have as somebody who studies politics and political participation is this another reason why people will just simply say, I'm not getting involved in this. I can't make sense of it. I can't be confident about what's really happening. And so I'm not going to feel confident to go and vote and actually participate. And I think that is a real risk, and that's why it's a threat to democracy.
Now, in that same Abacus Data poll, 47% of those surveyed were not confident they could identify AI-generated fake news content. Experts and newsroom fact-checkers report generative AI is increasing the spread of disinformation, and that is affecting democracy. Here's what they told us.
There's a big risk with AI-generated content, which is not flagged or identified as such, having the capacity to mislead people to think this is the actual voice of this politician. This is an actual video that represents that this thing happened, where in fact it was generated by using artificial intelligence technology, what we call deep fakes. So audio or visual material that is really compellingly almost real, but was actually artificially generated with some of these new techniques and technologies.
There are loads of examples we've already seen of where AI-generated content can be used to target women in particular. I think when it comes to disinformation, I always say that actually some of the simple tactics are still very effective for spreading disinformation. Just a meme or a video or a post. You don't actually even need AI at this point.
It's getting easier and easier to make more and more compelling images that are clear and kind of obviously real looking to most people when they aren't. With audio, it's also something very, very difficult to identify as being fake if it's a well-done audio fake, which in itself causes its own issues. And what my biggest fears is what starts happening isn't so much that it tricks people into believing stuff that isn't true, but it creates permission structures for people to ignore stuff that is true.
It's really hard to verify and debunk audio because the tools around forensics on it are not as advanced. And at the same time, you only have the audio signal. You don't have other visual material that you get in a photo or a video to try to figure out place, to try to figure out timing of it. So I think audio deepfakes present a really big challenge. And there's a big worry, of course, that we might be entering an age of audio deepfaked robocalls that end up misleading people, that end up smearing candidates and doing other bad things during elections.
In the last 2 years, especially in the last year, we've seen a rise in deepfakes, partially due to the fact that it is more accessible, more affordable for people to use it. And as well, we've also seen AI used to proliferate content. I'm not talking necessarily content of imagery, but text. So what used to be things that readers could instinctively understand as, that doesn't sound like someone who is really having that language as a mother tongue like I do. Therefore, maybe I don't really trust that. With the rise of AI, where they can generate text, it is increasingly more convincing that this is genuine text, even though the author may not really exist. You can have something in English that's misinformation, and then with a few clicks, you can have that exact same text in a believable way spread across dozens of languages. Also, when it comes to visuals, there are markers that you can look at, such as weird shaping of the hands. AI is still having trouble to make hands believable. Also, with movement, you can see that legs or arms tend to contort, or faces. And there are also other hallmarks that give us clues, such as if there are words in the background and it doesn't really make sense, it almost looks like hieroglyphics and it's not an actual language. This is another hallmark sign that this would be a deep fake.
We have seen Russian disinformation have a negative impact on support for Ukraine amongst right-leaning voters in the United States, for example. Support for Ukraine has declined dramatically over the past 2 years, and we see elements of the far right within the Republican Party amplifying Russian conspiracies and disinformation about Ukraine, including these bogus claims that Ukraine's Jewish president, President Zelensky, is somehow a neo-Nazi. And so, yeah, all of this is having an impact on Western societies. And again, we as Western societies need to start working together to start really pushing back against this, because if we don't, we're headed into potentially a very dark place.
Biases are inherent in any technology, and the way algorithms are, for instance, presenting material to people based on their preferences, based on computer estimations of what people find engaging, that sometimes leads to bias. If you have artificial intelligence systems, for instance, that are looking to classify images or classify text and make recommendations based on that, sometimes they will have bias. Sometimes they will be more likely to misidentify certain faces, to suggest words or images back that are based on certain things that the programmers, who are not necessarily as diverse, have reflected in those programs. One of the things we know that around political mobilization is that people are more likely to focus on those areas where they think people are more likely to vote. Campaigns are going to put more attention and resources in those physical locations or those communities where the pool of voters is more likely to actually go out and vote. That itself can be reflective of bias. Politics is a pretty bare-knuckle sport at times, but we're going to have to call out those people, those actors who are using deepfakes and other generative AI-generated images and text and video that are really about damaging and tearing down. We're going to have to call that out and say that's inappropriate.
It may be a myth that democracy is sort of a rational process, that it's based on the idea that we as voters, with whatever information we have available to us, make the best decisions at the polls. But to some extent, that myth is necessary. We have to believe that the system is rational on some level and that it can discern between truth and falsehood. And if we find that that's not the case, it, I think, will pose a significant problem to the fundamentals of our democracies.
Given social media's global reach, state actors use these platforms to spread disinformation quickly. In 2021, data engineer and scientist Frances Haugen took on another title, Facebook Whistleblower. She went public disclosing several concerns about Facebook, including its role in spreading disinformation. I sat down with Frances Haugen to learn more about what she experienced firsthand. Here's our conversation. Frances Haugen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Listen, I want to begin in 2019 because it was in that year that you were named the lead on the civic misinformation team at Facebook, and essentially worked on misinformation and democracy. And I'm kind of wondering, because it was a few years back already, what were you already seeing back then?
So it was interesting. I thought I was coming in to work on misinformation in, say, the United States or in Canada. But I showed up and in fact, I got put on misinformation anywhere Facebook lacked third-party fact checkers. So third-party fact checkers are the people who try to find individual stories and say, is this true or not? And what shocked me was the reality is for most users in the world, Facebook had no fact checking. And then they didn't just not have fact checking, for the vast majority of languages in the world, there are no safety systems. So Facebook only supported a few languages like English and French.
So you have this vast territory then. So how did you and your team go about identifying examples of misinformation, disinformation, and how did you deal with it?
So because we could not rely on fact checkers, we had to think more holistically about how to approach mis and disinformation. So if you can't look at individual stories, you have to ask questions like, why is the system as a whole promoting extreme content more than other content? And so our team initially focused on things like, can we identify when a place is surging with misinformation? Because Facebook had the tools to turn down the volume, turn down the heat, but they would only deploy them once there was active violence on the ground.
Okay, well, that leads me to my next question then, because of course things change. Famously, you become the Facebook whistleblower, something that you acknowledge yourself in your book of last year. What was the turning point for you? Where did you reach that you said to yourself, I can no longer work for Facebook?
Well, I think it's different than a question of I can no longer work for Facebook, because if I could, I would go back and work there today. Like, Facebook is so important. It is the internet for some of the most vulnerable people in the world, in places like African countries, Southeast Asia. But the question of, should I come forward? Is there information the public desperately needs? Am I willing to be a whistleblower? That happened when Facebook dissolved the civic integrity team. So the part of Facebook that was responsible for making sure Facebook was a positive force in the world. They dissolved it right after the 2020 election. And it was at that point that it became clear to me that Facebook couldn't course correct on its own, that it would need help from the public if it was going to be able to heal itself.
Okay, need help from the public. Do you think governments, public entities can actually do anything to counter misinformation, disinformation as it exists on social media?
So like I mentioned before, there's lots and lots of tools available. So imagine something as simple as, should you have to click on a link before you reshare it? Should you have to actually see the thing that you're going to share? That sounds like a really small change, but it leads to 10 or 15% less misinformation. There's a bunch of these changes like this that are not very complicated, that don't involve checking individual pieces of content. But the reason why they're not used today is the incentives are to maximize profit over maximizing public safety. So the thing the government can do is things like the Canadian Online Harms Bill. You can come there and shift the incentives. So suddenly when a platform has a change, I'll give you an example. There was a single change that would reduce misinformation on the platform by 35%. But it would also decrease usage of the platform by like 1%. Is 1% less profit worth 35% less misinformation? In a world where we don't get to see behind the curtain, like we don't get to see what the trade-offs were, Facebook demonstrated time and time again they would choose that profit over public safety.
As you're speaking, I also think, of course, the world has also changed with the advent of AI. And, that was not something you were dealing with in 2019 with Facebook. How does that complicate the picture when it comes to disinformation?
When we look at how we can address those problems, AI scales those systems in ways that we've never seen before. So it used to be you had to trade off between how many people do I want to pay for, like how many staff do I want to run my information campaign, versus how many times do I want to repeat what I'm saying. So you can have a few people who, if they repeat the same thing over and over again, they can run an influence operation. It used to be the way we'd catch these systems is by looking at that repetition. When you introduce AI, now every single piece of misinformation can be slightly different. There is no repetition. And we've already seen examples of technology being used in this way.
So given this extra layer then, when you consider the social responsibility that social media companies bear, Meta, X, others, what do you think they need to be doing in order to counter misinformation, disinformation?
Facebook every quarter posts how many fake accounts they take down. You would think with the rise of AI in the last year, the number of fake accounts they took down would go up dramatically. When you actually look at the stats, though, it dropped off a cliff. We don't know exactly why that is, but Facebook bragged last year about their year of efficiency. They went in and fired thousands of people who worked on trust and safety. My favorite researchers are all now outside the company and not voluntarily. The most important obligation for these social media companies is to adequately invest in teams to go and find the patterns of these fake accounts. Meta TikTok and X, they could all be taking down dramatically more fake accounts. And those are the ones that actually spread the misinformation. But they only can do that if they're willing to pay for the staffing to do so. Effective online accountability laws help shift those incentives. You know, every person who searches for a fake account costs money. They don't bring in more profit, or at least they don't in the short term. You know, having a system that's not pleasant because there's too many fake accounts does decrease long-term profitability. So we want laws that help shift those incentives so they make the right decisions each day.
Okay, shift the incentive. Does that need to be legislated though? Because I wonder, because you have met so many political leaders, not only in Canada, the United States, but around the world. What advice do you give them about the power of legislation?
Well, what I always frame for legislators is, we're beyond the point where nothing is going to happen. You know, it used to be there were kind of three options. Do you just keep the status quo, do nothing? Do you pass something practical, moderate, or do you pass something more extreme? What I always say is, for every social issue, there's a finite number of children we're willing to harm. And when we cross that line, often action is dramatic. What I always frame to people is, the choice now is not, do we act or not act? It's, do we act sooner with something practical and moderate, intentional? Or do we wait for the metaphorical wrong child to die and pass something emotional and extreme? We're already seeing little glimmers of this in the United States, where different states are passing radically different online harms bills. Do we want to have something extreme go through that maybe violates children's privacy? Or do we want to think about something intentional and practical and do it today?
You say we're beyond the point of doing nothing. So does that mean you're hopeful that we as a society have the tools to actually counter this?
I believe the European Union and the UK have demonstrated nations can act. Communities of nations can act. One of the things that I hope Canadians know is that the Canadian Online Harm Bill was created in a very different way than any other major piece of online regulation has in the last few years. They did lots of public assemblies. They went and had representative groups of Canadians argue about the conflicts inherent in these issues and come to compromises. You know, what is something we can agree to? And the Online Harm Bill, I'm so optimistic about it because it's tighter, it's more efficient than, say, what the European Union did. And I'm extremely excited about not just Canada passing it, but bringing it as model legislation to places like Australia or Brazil, which are also hungry for action, but might not have the access to resources that Canada does.
So how big is this threat of misinformation and disinformation in politics? We sat down with two people who know firsthand the challenges disinformation is having on democracies around the world. Here's a listen.
My name is Jonathan Vseviov, and I'm the Secretary General of the Estonian Foreign Ministry. For us democracies, misinformation and disinformation is frankly an existential threat. Not in of itself, but we need to be aware of the fact that these are tools used by our authoritarian challengers who wish to undermine democracy, destroy our ability to defend our way of life in the world, and create as much paralysis and chaos within our societies as they can. The Russian modus operandi when it comes to disseminating disinformation has been consistent with what they tried to do back in the days of the Cold War as the Soviet Union. Now, technology has changed. They now can use social media and the internet to disseminate their narratives, but the basic elements of the modus operandi have remained the same. So what they're trying to do is not convince us in our societies of an alternative version of the truth. What they're trying to do is disseminate enough false narratives to confuse us into paralysis and perhaps chaos. I mean, eventually, there's a risk that democracy will cease to work. If people lose trust in democratic institutions, I mean, democracies are so dependent upon trust. I mean, not trust vis-a-vis your political leaders per se, or trust vis-a-vis the political parties that you have. And this can change, and that's okay. I mean, this is normal in democracies to get politicians thrown out of office from time to time because they lose the trust of the public. The trust I'm talking about is trust vis-a-vis our institutions, the core institutions of our government. And if we start losing that, then we have a problem. And I think all around the free world, we're seeing this problem rather increase. The last time we as a human society went through a significant change in the way humans interact with each other was in the mid to late 19th century, when the printing press became a thing, and when industrialization brought people from the countryside to the cities, and it shook society and its institutions to the core. The absolutist monarchies of Europe were unable to reform themselves to meet the challenges of the day. The good thing is that democracy has, over time, proven to be extremely flexible. We're good at adapting to new situations because there are mechanisms in place in our system of government that help us alleviate pressure. If you're unhappy with the government, you can change your leading politicians. I'm sure the same challenges are confronting our authoritarian colleagues, if you will. There are no flexibility increasing mechanisms in their societies, so they're under pressure too. It's not as if we're the only ones that are being affected by these changes. The question is whether we have enough time and whether we're smart enough to adapt to the changing realities before the tensions grow too big. The rise of extremist political forces, the polarization within our societies are all indicators of the same big strategic change that is taking place. So we'd better take all of this seriously. Now, the attacks against us by authoritarian states like Russia need to be taken seriously as well, and they need to be dealt with in the short term. In the long term, we need to be able to adapt our democracies to the changing realities, and here again, education, I think, is going to be key.
Je dirais qu'aujourd'hui,
I would say that today, in 2024, one of the biggest problems for governments is that Silicon Valley and many tech platforms have changed their attitude to these issues. After the strategic surprise of 2016 and the discovery of the Russian campaign that targeted the 2016 US presidential election, we had a moment of proliferation, I'd say, where a lot of tools, methods, teams, and rules were quickly put into place to prevent these problems from recurring, so that platforms could more quickly detect this kind of manipulation and interference.
plus rapidement détecter ce genre de manipulation.
So that we can have a more transparent debate when they've detected something, so that they can share it, sometimes even share the data with researchers. And unfortunately, since 2020, there's been a change in attitude. A lot of the rules that were put in place after 2016 have been abandoned. Many of the teams that used to work on these subjects no longer work for these platforms. And many of the tools, particularly the tools that enabled researchers to access the data so that they could do these analyses themselves, have unfortunately been dismantled.
C'est ça le plus grand challenge.
So I'd say that in 2024, that's the biggest challenge for governments. And that's how we can make platforms accountable with regards to these issues of information manipulation and interference. It's also a time when we have new technologies, for example, at a time where there will be a huge number of elections in 2024. We're also wondering how to manage both the risks and the opportunities for defense and detection that technologies like generative AI can bring.
Même si parfois les
I'm realistic, but also optimistic, and I'll tell you why. I think that even if democracies sometimes take a little longer to find the regulatory framework to answer these questions, we're still making progress. And for example, I think what's happening in Europe with the Digital Services Act, the DSA, the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, and the AI Act is also a hopeful time for a regulatory format that will enable us to hold platforms accountable, continue innovation, and thus create a digital space that reflects our democratic values.
Ils sont lents, ils sont réels, et que ce sont ces nouveaux.
I believe that even if progress is sometimes slow, it is real, and that it is the new legal framework that needs to be implemented. I also believe that we are at a moment of renewal in the technologies we use. There are new technologies, but also new platforms. And finally, as a teacher, when I look at my students, I see that the newer generations are also very concerned about these issues. They often think about privacy in social networks. They often think about the reliability of the information they consume. And I'm also hopeful about this new generation, which has perhaps grown up with these digital tools more than any of us, and has a certain requirement to use them.
We've just heard concerns about artificial intelligence, democracy, and disinformation. Are these concerns shared by all Canadians? And what does our poll reveal about voters looking to the next federal election in 2025? Philippe Fournier, founder of Quebec 125, shares his views.
I think there's a lot of mistrust of artificial intelligence software, especially conversational software, where by writing questions you can converse with the machine. I'm not so much afraid of artificial intelligence overtaking us, I'm afraid we'll stoop to it. And in an electoral context, people could receive calls, text messages, and emails that aren't written by humans with good intentions, but rather by robots, by machines that can say anything that aren't bound by a certain journalistic rigor, precisely because they're robots or machines.
Humains avec des bonnes intentions, mais bien par des robots qui peuvent dire un peu n'importe quoi, qui ne sont pas tenus à une certaine rigueur journalistique parce que justement ce sont des robots. Alors, dans un contexte électoral,
so in an election context, could a party decide to just completely drown the available information in a sea of comments, of GPT chats? The answer is yes. I hope it doesn't come to that, however. But if the end justifies the means and you have to win at all costs, some politicians might see this as an advantage over their rivals.
Pourraient y voir un avantage par rapport à leurs rivaux. Ben, pour les partisans de la démocratie, en effet, c'est un problème.
For proponents of democracy, it's a problem. For those who think it's normal to have elections that are based on a debate of ideas. One party wins, one party loses. There's a rotation of people in power. I think it's worrying to see politicians who are more and more inclined to say, I don't want to have a democracy, I want my side to win at all costs. And AI is allowing them to do that. Could this tool once again drown out all the available information? The aim is not so much to propagandize, but to make people as cynical as possible so that they believe nothing. And the poll figures point a little in that direction. People are worried. But I don't think Canadians really know how to react, how to legislate on this. Of course, I'd like voters to be as informed as possible, but again, information takes effort, whereas misinformation is very passive. We sit in front of our disinformation screen and absorb it. So it's not just happening in Canada, of course, it's happening everywhere. Western countries are facing problems like this. I don't know what the solution is. I'm curious to see how our leaders will choose to deal with this. Retake after, of course. All Western countries are facing such problems. I don't know what the solutions are, and I'm curious to see how our leaders will choose to deal with these issues.
71% of Canadians are somewhat or very concerned about the state of democracy in Canada. According to the CPAC-commissioned Abacus data poll, nearly 3/4 of those surveyed believe important information is being hidden from the public.
Coming up, we'll be talking to Elections Canada, members of Parliament, experts, and people on the front lines of technology about the work they do to combat disinformation, educate the public, and protect the democratic process. But first, we wanted to know whether Canadians have confidence in the current political system. Let's listen.
Je pense que c'est compliqué.
I think it's complicated because it's an issue that would require government control over social networks that would be complicated to implement, I think.
Je pense.
Je suis pas sûre parce que c'est quelque chose qui est trop wild pour être contenu, j'ai l'impression. Ils vont essayer.
I'm not sure, because it's something that's gone too far to be contained. I have a feeling that they're going to try and do something about it. They're going to put in controls and it's going to trickle down. But it's always going to leak out. If you're attracted to an idea, it's going to trickle down anyway. But you can try to put a stop to it, but I don't think it's going to work in the end.
Ouais, il peut les protéger s'il met le paquet pour pouvoir mettre les choses en place. normal. We can protect it if we pull out all the stops. We can do it.
J'aimerais penser que oui.
I'd like to think so. We're pretty far from a solution. I'm hopeful.
Que fait donc Élections Canada?
What is Elections Canada doing to prepare Canadians for the next federal election and to protect the democratic process? Mathieu McKenna is a spokesperson for Elections Canada.
À la fin de la journée, je pense que les Canadiens peuvent avoir confiance que l'information qu'ils cherchent.
At the end of the day, I think Canadians can trust that the information they get from bodies like Elections Canada is accurate and reliable. I think it's very important that they have a reliable source of information, so we encourage them to come to us for that information. I think that in any free society, there's always the risk of a bit of inaccurate information circulating, especially during an election period when the amount of information increases.
Avoir un peu d'informations inexactes en circulation, surtout pendant une période électorale où le volume d'informations s'augmente. Alors, je pense que c'est important que les Canadiens ont confiance que...
I think it's important that Canadians come to us looking for the right information to navigate Canada's electoral system. I think everyone has a role to play in checking their sources and making sure that the information they're looking for is accurate and reliable.
L'information qu'ils cherchent est exacte et fiable.
We know from our poll that Canadians view disinformation as a problem and that 46% consider it a major threat to democracy. What can be done to help Canadians identify disinformation and prevent further erosion of trust in our institutions? Here's what a few experts recommended.
We need to start paying attention to that erosion of trust, learning from our allies who have recognized this breakdown of trust within their own societies and have gone about looking to develop strategies to develop cohesion, develop strategies that will build long-term resilience against these efforts in their countries. We could also be looking at a government like Sweden, which has set up a psychological defense unit within its government, because this is truly, I mean, this is what's being attacked. Our cognitive awareness, and when we're talking about foreign governments, our cognitive sovereignty is under attack. So having a section of a unit within the government that is actively looking to identify, monitor, identify and expose and counter those narratives is critically important.
Smartphone technology has changed the way we interact with information, and that's affecting the younger generation especially. So we think there should be an education-led approach. They're getting all their information from social media, and we need to make sure that's a healthy space with healthy discourse, and that the truth is not only something that we seek, but it has value. And if we aren't teaching that to young people, then they won't value the truth. They won't see it's any more valuable than the grifters or the liars or people with their own agendas that they see online all the time.
Can Canada do more? Yes, it absolutely should do more. Some of it is even resourcing. It's funding the research. It's supporting organizations like Media Smarts that do so much to develop media literacy. It's looking more closely at education of children on these digital literacy issues. And I think that requires collaboration between federal and provincial governments, because the powers of these different governments is different to deal with these issues. So it requires collaboration, and we don't have that right now.
If Canada is going to succeed in this moment of great change, we won't do that by being alone. We won't be doing that by retreating to our comfortable spaces of just the things we want to believe. We're going to do that by reaching across difference, by being committed to a positive future, but one that's well governed. And so that means people getting more involved in their democracy, and it means leaders and technologists being more responsive to what the people are seeking from us in this moment.
With a majority of Canadians saying they are concerned about the state of our democracy, just how strong is it? Here's part of my conversation with Taylor Owen, founding director of the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy at McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy. How do you describe the state of Canadian democracy right now?
The state of Canadian democracy is relatively strong compared to both other comparator peer countries and some of our concerns that are very dominant in the public discourse. I think we're actually in a better position than we often like to acknowledge, or where the political incentives sort of align to acknowledging. That being said, most of the trend lines through which we measure the health of a democracy are getting worse. So I'd say we're on a negative trajectory for most measures, not all, but most measures of democratic health.
Tell me a bit more about those measures.
What components of a democracy signal health? One might be how many people participate in the public discourse. In many cases, that's increasing in some really real structural ways. More people in our society can participate, are allowed to participate in our discourse, are encouraged to, right? So like in some ways, that's considerably better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. On the other hand, the nature of our digital ecosystem and some of the harms that are present in it are forcing out certain groups rather than others. So you have to kind of counterbalance those two things together, that overall more people are much more free to participate in the public discourse, but the harms of the ecosystem are censoring and silencing and forcing out some people over others. So the trend of that is sort of the positive trend we've been on is being counteracted by the design of the digital ecosystem that's forcing some people out. So I think that's a challenge. I think something like polarization, again, not obvious necessarily, because some degree of polarization is always going to be present in a democracy. Like that, we're not going to agree on everything. Does that make us polarized from one another? Well, as long as we have a chance to articulate our differences and to potentially reconcile them, or to have democratic choices that represent our differences and still value each other as members of society, then polarization is okay. However, the trend of that is effective polarization, which means I don't just disagree with you about X issue, I actively dislike you because of your belief. Or I don't want my kids playing with your kids because of our differences of belief on any topic. That kind of like harsher friction, that often called effective polarization, is on the rise. So polarization itself, not necessarily a huge problem, but effective polarization, active dislike of someone from their belief, which we're seeing more and more of, in part driven by the nature, again, of our digital ecosystem, is a negative trend. So I think across all these different variables, we need to be balancing these overall trajectories that we've been on as a society with some of these new variables that are driven in many ways by the ways in which we're having conversations now, the ways in which we're participating democratically as a society in our public sphere, which is mediated by technology. And so my focus really is on trying to understand how that mediation by technology either improves or in many cases harms that health of our democracy.
Let's talk about those harms a little bit more. How is disinformation impacting democracy?
So in many ways. At the baseline, some degree of accepted reality is required for a democratic society. So just at the highest level, we all need to agree on some sort of basic framework through which we are going to participate as citizens in a democracy. We can't all believe in fundamentally different versions of reality. And large-scale disinformation campaigns do that. They undercut the kind of core basis on which we can disagree, that kind of factual reality on which we can then have democratic disagreements. So that's like one way it happens, one way it affects democracy. Another way, though, is a little more subtle, which is how does it artificially influence our views in ways that aren't always knowable by us, that aren't often counteractable, because we don't even really know it's happening. When this system breaks down, when it gets corrupted by false information or by foreign interference or by just the engagement metrics on an algorithm, any of these variables that change, or the loss of journalism in our ecosystem, right? Like that's a variable that's changed the structure and character of the ecosystem.
As we think about how technology and social media platforms are changing so fast, do we have appropriate guardrails to, safeguard our institutions, our citizenry from the spread of disinformation and misinformation?
No, absolutely not. We've been unbelievably slow in setting up those guardrails, either using the existing tools we have and seeing how they work in this new digital ecosystem. So existing privacy laws. We haven't updated our privacy law yet. You'd think that would be the first thing you would do when all of a sudden we know that a large number of the harms we see on the internet are related to our data being used in a malicious way, right? Maybe the first thing we would have done is taken the tool we already have, which is privacy law, and adapted it to the internet in a sophisticated way. We didn't. Maybe we'd be concerned about the biggest companies in human history having increasing power over our economy and the character of our democratic society, and use competition policy to maybe sort of create more dynamism in the digital economy. We haven't done that. Maybe we would update our hate speech laws and laws around influencing elections. And we've done a little bit of that, but not much yet. None of it's passed, very little of it's actually passed. So we haven't even done the things that we have the tools to do, let alone begin to think seriously about what to do about more frontier technologies like AI or different kinds of computational capacity or biotechnologies, or all these things that we know we're on the cusp of that might require new regulatory and policy tools. So it's immensely frustrating that I don't think we take, now the discourse has changed considerably in the last few years. Like I think we are at least acknowledging the need for this, but we've been very slow to do it.
What concerns you the most as you look to the next federal election?
What worries me is that it's very difficult to imagine sweeping structural change happening in our regulatory environment, in our media and technology environment between now and then. So we're probably pretty locked into the path we're on. And that is a ecosystem that's pretty vulnerable to external shocks, that's pretty vulnerable to foreign influence, that's very difficult to see into because, again, the companies are sort of closing off access to visibility into their systems. Like researchers no longer have access to watch and participate and understand these systems. So I think we're heading into a fairly opaque period with a new technology being added to it that arguably makes it more opaque. So the more AI there is in the system, the less it's knowable. And I think my core concern would be we trust facts less and less. As you say, we trust our institutions that used to help us determine facts and reality less. And we don't have visibility into the system and that's determining what we see and how and why. So I think there's some things to be concerned about for the next election, for sure.
Disinformation, democracy, educating the public. How do Canadians feel about our democracy, and do they believe the country's going in the right direction? Let's bring back now David Coletto from Abacus Data.
I've been doing polling for almost 20 years. I have not seen a period in which a clear majority of Canadians think the country's headed in the wrong direction. Only 1 in 4 think it's headed on the right track. That's lower than what it was during the first few weeks of the pandemic, as an example. What that means is when times are tough, right, people do a few things. They start to experiment with political ideas or parties that they may not normally look to because all they want are their outcomes to get better. But what that also does, when we're feeling anxious, when we're feeling frustrated, when we're feeling hopeless in many ways, is we're more easily persuaded, perhaps, to believe something that may not be true. And so the reason why, it's almost a perfect storm is happening, in which technology is changing so quickly, how we get information has never been so fragmented, and we're just really, really grumpy and anxious. And you mix that all together, and it creates the cocktail for rage, for populist politics that we've seen around the world, and we're seeing, I think, emerge in Canada as well. There are some who are just deeply skeptical about any government intervention in their lives, and then there's others who think the nature of our politics, the rhetoric, the direction of other democracies may be coming here, and that worries people as well.
With many Canadians worried about our democracy, what is the government doing to ensure our democracy and its electoral process are protected? CPAC did request an interview with the minister responsible for public safety and democratic institutions, Dominic LeBlanc. That request was declined, and no other minister was made available to discuss the issue with us. But we did catch up with two members of Parliament, Liberal MP Anthony Housefather and NDP MP Alistair McGregor, to talk about their work to combat disinformation and foreign interference in our elections. The Conservatives did not make anyone available. Anthony Housefather, Alistair McGregor, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Now, both of you have talked about misinformation and disinformation in the past, but Anthony, I'm going to start with you because you're part of the ethics committee. You've been looking into misinformation, disinformation, how that affects the work of parliamentarians. What concerns you most? Based on what you've heard in testimony, what concerns you the most?
I think what concerns me the most is that social media companies have tons of misinformation floating upon it. Most people today, especially young people, get their news from platforms like TikTok or other social media platforms. And when you get your news from there, you start believing every little thing that you read on there. And what the social media platforms also do is they use algorithms to direct you to content that they believe you will like in order to monetize the platform and keep you there as long as possible. So people, if you believe in a certain type of misinformation, are directed to more of that misinformation. And eventually you come out with a worldview that is very different than if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Globe and Mail or the National Post.
Mm-hmm. Alistair, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would largely agree. I think what people have to remember about social media platforms is that these aren't your traditional public squares. They are all owned by a company which is interested in turning a profit. And they do that by generating more content that gets people engaged. And often that's content that makes people angry or anxious. And again, through the algorithms that they employ, it drives people further down into echo chambers, which tends to reinforce. And I think, like Anthony, I was first elected in 2015. And I think one of the troubling things I've seen is that, people will come to you with alternative facts, which are verifiably not true, but they're so firmly held in belief by people. And you can't really use a logical type of argument because so much of their emotion is tied into it, so much of their worldview. So it's very challenging because I've always prided myself in being a politician who tries to deal with facts and uncovering the truth, but it's made our job a lot difficult.
It made your job, and not only you, because CPAC commissioned a poll, which Abacus Data did for us, and in their survey, they found that 46% of people said they considered disinformation a major threat to democracy. So if that is, nearly 1 in 2 of Canadians being surveyed saying that, what should the government be doing to stop the spread of disinformation?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few things that need to be done. Some of it government related, some of it not. Number one, we need to make sure that foreign actors are not involved in our democracy spreading misinformation. I think one of the things that you sort of learn is that the posts that you're seeing on X or other platforms isn't necessarily done by the person across the street or in your city or in Canada. They could be coming from Russia, they could be coming from Iran, they could be coming from countries that have a specific reason why they want to create division within North America and Canada and the United States. Anti-Semitism, for example, Michael, is being used by Russia and by Iran to try to divide Canadians and Americans by putting up posts that simply amplify hate and try to encourage people domestically to have that hate. So we need to find a way to deal with that, and we need to make social media companies actually deal with the problem because they're the ones that control the posts, they're the ones that control what the algorithms are. And you don't want to have laws that say what you can or cannot post, but you need to have truth seekers, you need to have fact checkers that will say, this post is actually not accurate. Please go read X. And some social media companies are better at doing that than others.
Mm-hmm. Social media, but does that mean to say that it should lean more on social media, not on governments?
Well, to me, government cannot be the arbiter of what you read or don't read, because if in the end, right, you don't want the party in power to be able to control what the press writes or what social media companies can or cannot write or what you can or cannot write. But there's a lot of misinformation floating out there, and to me, the responsibility is that of the social media company to allow for flagging of that and to not use algorithms to drive you into a cesspool where if you believe in conspiracy theories, all the posts that you read are from that conspiracy theory, and that is what they do.
Alistair, what would you say to that in terms of government responsibility versus others?
Well, I mean, I think we need some measure of algorithmic transparency at holding these companies accountable for their terms of service and investing in fact-checking, because again, I know people might grow concerned about a growing government role in this, but in the absence of that, what you're essentially saying is you're trusting people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg to do the policing for you. Billionaire CEOs whose only interest is to get more profit returned to their companies to pad their bank accounts. So again, if you remove the word social, these are media companies. You as a journalist and all media, traditional media, are held to journalistic standards. I think we need to see some sort of similar thing where there is some reliable way of fact-checking the content that is put out there, because again, it gets disseminated so fast and so quickly, and we're often having to be put in the positions as politicians to react to it.
I obviously agree with Alistair about algorithm transparency. I mean, that is something that is absolutely required, and also there is legislation now on that would hold social media platforms to follow their own rules and respect their own rules, and that is completely within bounds. I think the only issue gets into whether or not you require them to actually verify that everything placed on their platforms, which is coming from third parties, is true or not true. That might be a bit of a stretch.
It's interesting because we're talking about social media. I'm wondering about politicians, though, too. If journalists have a journalistic standard, do politicians need to be held to a standard as well? Because you use the terminology, Alistair, of alternative facts. That came from Kellyanne Conway in regards to a comment made by a politician. Do politicians harm democracy by using disinformation to make their argument? And if so, do politicians need to be held accountable at some level?
Well, I suppose the gray way of holding a politician to account is come election time. That is the ultimate accountability test for a politician. But again, there are certain politicians, and this happens in all countries, which have built up a personal brand as being sort of an over-the-top type of personality, and maybe cherry picking some of the facts to suit a narrative that they're trying to sell people. It's hard because we want our politicians to enjoy that freedom of speech, of being able to rise up to the moment to say what is on their mind. But again, there has to be some kind of a mechanism, and I'm not sure I have the actual answer here, where they're also held to account, or at least where we help the people who elect them hold them to account with some kind of a fact-checking system.
What do you say to that, Anthony?
I don't know how you would be able to hold politicians to the journalistic standards you're talking about, but I think that all politicians themselves have responsibility, right? I think that we need to try to bring the temperature down, not bring the temperature up, and not try to make people hate each other. And I think that, unfortunately, there's a number of our colleagues whose goal seems to be to make people angry all the time.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the time on this. Anthony Housefather, Alistair McGregor, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Now, the speed of the spread of disinformation is facilitated through the internet and social media platforms. So we spoke with representatives from Meta, X, TikTok, and Google about the tools they use to combat the spread of disinformation and the challenges they face. We begin right now with Kevin Chan. He is the Global Policy Campaign Strategies Director at Meta and talks more on their response to disinformation on their Facebook and Instagram platforms.
Any disinformation that we find on our platforms or that's reported to us, we will investigate. And if we can confirm that this is in fact malicious actors that are behaving in what we call an inauthentic way, meaning they know something to be true and yet are saying something else, if we know that this behavior is present on our platforms, we actually investigate and then we remove not only the accounts that are perpetrating this, but also all the content associated with those accounts. And then we take additional measures to make sure, using various signals, to make sure that these people actually aren't able to return to the platform to try to continue to do what they've been doing.
Okay, so if you will, can you talk to us about the tools you use then? You talk about tracking it, investigating it. Talk to us a bit more about the tools that you actually use here to identify and stop disinformation.
Sure. So we're looking at really two broad sets of tools. One is human review. So we actually have hired, we have close to 40,000 people working on this globally. We do have also experts that have been trained in this kind of work, investigative work in signals intelligence, that are helping to investigate these things. And so we will do proactive reviews to find these things ourselves. But like I said, we also have a team of experts that look at different networks around the world and try to map those networks to whether or not they have a presence on our platform, and then do that hard investigative work. So there's human review. But then there's also the proactive artificial intelligence and automated reviews that we do. And that is really allowing us to do this at scale. With the advent of new technologies like generative AI, where there are now, artificial intelligence is able to generate almost lifelike images and videos, we have added an additional layer of protection and transparency, whereby if there is industry standard watermarks and other signals on images that are created by generative AI, we will label those as such, so that when you're on Facebook or Instagram and you encounter these images or videos, you will be able to see that they're clearly labeled as generated by artificial intelligence. But the other thing that we do is for advertising. We're going to now require for any kind of political advertising that people may choose to run, if it is generated through artificial intelligence, we will require the advertiser to disclose this before they're able to actually run the ad.
Back in 2020, though, in the US, Facebook essentially dissolved its civic integrity team. So I'm wondering what you have now in place. You mentioned the work here in Canada with Elections Canada, but what have you put into place in terms of ensuring election integrity? How does that work?
Well, we've been working on this, as you know, for many, many years. We had a Canadian Election Integrity Initiative in Canada in 2019, and we had it also in 2021 for both of those elections. And I think you can anticipate that we will provide and be focused on the same kind of initiatives and tools and tactics for the future election, whenever that will be.
Respectfully, in the United States, Meta said that political speech is ineligible for fact-checking, and that applies to photos, videos, other content created by candidates, essentially giving candidates carte blanche to put out what they will on your platforms. Why are politicians exempt from fact-checking?
You would agree. It's not proper for a private sector company to be able to decide whether or not an individual candidate in a democracy, it is not proper for a private entity to be deciding whether or not that person should have the right to say what they want to say. That is a process that needs to be sorted out through the democratic process. We are a platform that enables people to share and engage with the electorate, but we certainly don't want to put our thumb on the scale in any particular way. We do have centuries of developed institutions that do that in an election campaign context, and we think it's best for them to do that.
X, formerly Twitter, turns to their users to help stop the spread of disinformation. It is called Community Notes. Wilfredo Fernandez is the head of US and Canada Global Government Affairs at X and says their research shows Community Notes is the best approach for them.
Community Notes is powered by a network of contributors like you and me. So what does it take to become a contributor? First, you have to have an account in good standing, have an account for at least 6 months, have a verified phone number. This helps us with determining the authenticity of the contributors. We're onboarding contributors every week in a fair and random process. We now have over 500,000 contributors around the world. Community Notes is available in 70 countries, in every language that X is offered. And so once you become onboarded, you start rating notes. And as you rate notes that are rated helpful, your rating impact score increases, and eventually you unlock the ability to write notes. That's a privilege that you can lose if you write too many notes that are actually unhelpful. Your participation in the program is anonymized, so you're given an alias when you sign up. And so what this does is really, it puts the power in the hands of the people to add the context. And X, on our end, we have no power to place or remove a note. This is important because this helps build trust in the system.
So does that mean then that it will be the community that determines what is potentially misinformation, disinformation, or will X still have a team to determine that?
So this is one intervention, and then we have a couple other misleading information policies. One is our civic integrity policy, which is active around elections, and that's meant to address misleading information that could interfere with people's participation in the franchise of voting. And then we have a synthetic and manipulated media policy. This is a long-standing policy of ours that addresses synthetic and manipulated media. It could be what's commonly known as deepfakes. It could also address out-of-context media. We see this a lot recently in the Israel-Hamas conflict, where you've seen videos of other theaters of war from different years, and we can label that as manipulated and synthetic media. And so those are other two policies that sort of address different types of misleading information.
Okay, but why does X believe that community notes are the best way, a good way of discouraging, stopping disinformation from happening?
So what the research is showing is that people will trust this sort of decentralized system more because it is powered by the people. Again, we can address more information at scale by empowering contributors and giving them the tools. So, one example is manipulated media. So you can actually write a community note on a specific piece of media, and then that note will appear automatically on any other post that contains that media. So we've had about 3,500 notes written on media that have shown on 330,000 different posts. So by giving people and contributors that sort of superpower to be able to really give annotation and context to thousands of posts in one fell swoop is pretty powerful.
In terms of elections, are there special preparations that take place for X to get ready for an election, in particular to prepare for potential state actors who might try to use a social media platform to influence an outcome?
When we're talking about election settings, there are a lot of different aspects to the conversation that we need to be prepared for. It's not just misleading information about how to vote, it's violent speech, it's impersonation and dealing with deceptive identities. It's all different types of manipulated media. And yeah, as you mentioned, being prepared for potential platform manipulation. And so we have a threat disruption team that focuses day in and day out on thwarting all different types of, whether it's coordinated inauthentic behavior or spam or any type of platform manipulation that could impact the public conversation. So yeah, we're ever ready for elections. Here in the US, we're participating in tabletop exercises with local elections officials just to game out different scenarios that could happen in the lead up, working with secretaries of state and state elections directors. We've met several times with Elections Canada, in preparation for whenever the next election may be. And so that's part of our work day in and day out on my team, is working with governments at the federal, state, provincial level to be ready for elections.
TikTok reportedly has over 1 billion monthly active users. Like Meta, they say they have over 40,000 trust and safety professionals around the globe to identify content that violates their community guidelines. And like X, they also empower users with tools to determine interactions with others. But what is TikTok doing to educate users? Steve DeAir is Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs at TikTok.
So we work with partners around the world. We actually have a network of over 19 global fact checkers. They operate in 50 languages around the world, and they help us assess the accuracy of things that are posted to TikTok. And then we can use that independent determination when making decisions about removing content under our misinformation policies. We also work with partners. I mentioned Media Smarts here in Canada. Just last month, we released with them our Guardian's Guide for TikTok. It's the first time We've done this type of project in Canada. And what that is a document for Canadian parents and guardians, particularly those who might not be on TikTok or aren't familiar with TikTok, and to help them understand the platform, some of the terminology, and in particular the settings that exist, and so they can have those conversations with their teens. We also offer something within the app called family pairing, and that allows the parent to control the privacy settings and screen time and things like that on their teen's device without having to actually wrestle the device away from them.
Okay. You know, I also want to talk about generative AI right now, and wondering if TikTok actually labels AI generated content. Are there rules about the use of that content on your platform?
We were actually one of the first platforms to pioneer a tool to allow a creator, a user, to just a simple toggle when they're uploading the video will apply a badge to that video so that any user that sees it will know that it's AI generated content. That's something I'm starting to see more and more often in the app. Over 37 million creators have actually used that tool since we launched it last fall.
Okay. Now, 5 years ago, TikTok announced that it was banning politicians from election-related ads on the platform. Is that ban still in effect? And secondly, does it apply the same around the world?
You're absolutely correct. We do not allow political or issue advertising on the platform. That is a global 365-day-a-year policy that applies. And that's because, again, the type of authentic, fun content that people come to TikTok for, that we know our community loves to engage with and watch, paid political advertising doesn't really fit into that. And so we made that decision that it's not something that we allow on the platform.
Your platform has been banned by several governments over cybersecurity concerns related to it being owned by someone based in China. What assurances can TikTok provide to countries like Canada that this platform will not be used by foreign state actors to interfere or to sow misinformation, disinformation leading up to and during an election?
We take those concerns really seriously, and we disagree with them because we are working extensively to ensure the security of our platform. Just to touch on a few things. We have not, and we never would share Canadian user data with the Chinese government. We publish a transparency report twice a year that lists all of the government or law enforcement requests for information from us that require proper judicial authorization, and we've never received one from China, and we would refuse if we were to receive one. Canadian user data is stored in the United States, Singapore, Ireland, and Malaysia, period. Our parent company, ByteDance, is a private company. We've worked on over 150 major elections globally over the past few years. We're getting ready for the US election, obviously later this year, and the Canadian election to be coming pretty soon after that. In the 2021 election in Canada, we actually worked with Elections Canada to create an in-app hub for TikTok users that gave Canadians information on when, where, and how to vote. And that was authenticated information from Elections Canada, and it linked out to their website. And a link to that in-app hub appeared on every single election-related video that Canadians saw during the election. And that year in 2021, we were actually the only new platform to sign on to the Federal Privy Council Office's Canada Declaration on Election Integrity, and that outlined ways that platforms and the government would work together to counter things like misinformation.
Alphabet, the parent company of Google and YouTube, is the largest internet company in the world. So what are the biggest challenges they face trying to stop the spread of disinformation? Jeanette Patel is the Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Google Canada.
Google's core mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful for our users around the world. So, in order to do that, we need to prioritize authoritative information and ensure that users understand, the credibility of what they're encountering online. I have to say, when it comes to elections, that's more important than ever. So we've been doing a number of things in that regard to support elections on our platform. So whether that's through our products and connecting voters with trusted sources and giving them more context around what they're seeing, or by providing additional layers of security to high-risk entities, and then by safeguarding our platforms themselves against abuse or misuse.
Well, we'll dig into that. But I know that earlier in May, Google essentially introduced new AI search tools, and on the positive of that, it makes things faster. You get your information quicker. It helps with the way people work. But at the same time, there have been instances where the results found on AI were incorrect. Essentially, they were wrong. So, what are some of the challenges that AI presents when it comes to disinformation?
With any new or emerging technology, there's both risks and opportunities. And so, when it comes to things like AI overview or search tools, AI in search, we are taking a pretty cautious approach. We know that when it comes to certain queries, we want to connect users back to search so that they're connecting directly with authoritative content.
And I think part of that has to do with this whole team that Google has now set up, essentially to tackle those types of challenges. Tell us about that initiative.
So, we have a number of teams that are being set up across the company, both whether that's with the development and deployment of our AI tools, or to assess and disrupt threats that are targeting our platforms. And so maybe actually I'll dig into that a little bit more. When you think about the various threats that are out there and the use of AI by bad actors, we know that bad actors everywhere will kind of leverage new technology as soon as it becomes available to them. But we also see a really valuable opportunity for us to enhance our abuse fighting efforts through also leveraging AI even more. So our teams are using AI to identify, detect, and disrupt those threat actors in all of their activities.
So using essentially the same technology that others are abusing, but trying to essentially address that abuse.
That's right, and stay one step ahead of the game.
So walk us through a bit more through the process then. When Google discovers any type of disinformation, what is the process? What happens with that?
When it comes to something like a coordinated influence campaign around disinformation, for example, our threat intelligence teams, many of whom, in fact, are based in Montreal, they work proactively to identify those and to disrupt those campaigns. And then they also work closely with law enforcement or security agencies to give them the information that they would need so that they can start their own investigations. We also think that transparency is key here. So we publish on a quarterly basis what we're finding. And those transparency reports are available to everyone so that we can all be vigilant and well-informed.
In the coming months, we will be sharing more of these interviews and information online about disinformation. Visit our website at cpac.ca or on CPAC's YouTube channel.
Cet automne, nous allons aborder.
This fall, we're going to be tackling the issue of online harm and cyberbullying in a special public debate. According to Public Safety Canada, 3 out of 10 young Canadians say they have been victims of cyberbullying. We'll be looking at what's being done to educate and protect users.
I'm Michael Serapio.
And I'm Omera Issa. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching.